Hi students, for the second half of this week of the class, I'm going to do the lectures on YouTube instead of in the classroom. And so this second half of the week, we're continuing to talk about the classical age. Last time I introduced you to Athens and Sparta, these two most important Greek city-states, as the city-states of Greece are emerging in the classical age. And then in the second half of the week, we're going to talk about these Greek city-states on a broader stage, interacting on a broader canvas across the Mediterranean. And we're going to begin with the part of Greek history that is most famous, the story of the Persian Wars. We're going to begin by looking at this interaction that's become so famous between these emerging Greek city-states and the huge Persian Empire. And so to set the scene, I want to take you back a couple of weeks ago when we had finished week 2. We talked about the Middle East. I'd kind of set the context and I'd explained how, in terms of the chronology, I'd run on ahead of ancient Greece. I said, basically, we have these two strands that are going, and I've taken the non-Greek Middle Eastern strand. That's kind of the context of the Mediterranean in which Greek history is happening. And I've taken it all the way from 2500 BC all the way up to 500, 550 BC. And that now in week 3 with the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, week 4 with the Dark Age and the Archaic Age, and even into this week, I'm going to be bringing the Greek strand of history up alongside that. And so now I just want to match them up again for you so you can kind of see where we are. So you think about ancient Egypt, you think about the Hyksos, you think about the development of the New Kingdom. That happens around 1500. 1500 is around the time when you have the Mycenaean civilization and the fall of the Minoan civilization. Okay, just so we've got those lined up. So right at the same time as the new kingdom of Egypt is being developed is when the Mycenaeans are moving into Greece, are taking control of the trading networks that the Minoans had established in that part of the Mediterranean, establishing themselves as a serious power. Fast forward a little further on, we have the end of the Bronze Age, and so we have the fall of Troy. Shortly afterwards, we have the fall of the Mycenaeans, and also we have the weakening of the Egyptians. Move on a little further to around 900. Now we're just starting to come out of the Dark Ages. We're coming towards the end of the Dark Ages. In Greece, we're moving into the Archaic Age. We have these established city-states. In the Middle East, we have the Assyrian Empire. Powerful, terrifying, militaristic. So that's around 800. Keep moving forward, and we come to 600. By 600, we are well past or deep into the Archaic Age in ancient Greek history, and the Persian Empire is just about to emerge. Persian Empire is about to emerge, and the Assyrian Empire has fallen. Nineveh has been sacked. I'm just going to skip back a slide or two here, if I can. Let me bring up my PowerPoint here. I'm going to move back a couple of slides, again, just to set the context for you. So we have the reforms of Solon. That's in 594. It's about 20 years after the fall of Nineveh and the fall of the Assyrian Empire. We have the tyranny of Pisistratus that we talked about last time. So this is the point where we have, this is 2 years before Cyrus captures the city of Babylon. 2 years before the Persian Empire rises to become a major power. So you can see that as Athens and Sparta are developing, these aspects of the Middle East are also the history of the Middle East. We're kind of bringing these strands together. Okay, so Hippias and Hipparchus succeed Pisistratus. Eventually they're driven out. This is right around the time the Persian Empire is expanding. I'm going to move through the system of Pericles, and then we'll come to the new material that we're going to look at in the second half of the week. So we're in the 6th century. Athens and Sparta have their established forms of government, but the main power in the world is the huge Persian Empire that's established itself in this period of expansion during the 6th century. And remember, we talked about the places where the Persian Empire expands to. Persian Empire expands to Babylon, captures the city of Babylon, keeps expanding further, and it conquers the Lydians. The Lydians who are in Anatolia, a center of trade because they're a meeting point of east and west, center of wealth and coinage. They are conquered by the Persians. They're taken over. Their king is allowed to remain the king of Lydia, but he has to acknowledge Cyrus as his ruler. But the Persians, of course, aren't going to stop with the conquest of Lydia. They're going to continue to move further west. As they move further west, they start to come to the edge of Anatolia and they start to seize Greek cities in Ionia. Greek cities in Ionia, that's the very western edge of Anatolia. Remember first wave Greek colonization that we talked about in the Dark Ages. Mycenaeans who are able to flee from the Dorians and establish themselves on the west coast of Anatolia, establish Greek colonies there. And so the Persians start to expand their influence into this area. And they start to demand that the Greek cities in Ionia, Greek cities in western Anatolia, accept their sovereignty. Typical Persian approach. You are allowed to have continue your trade. This seems to be what Greeks do, but you have to accept the rule of the Persian emperor. You're going to have to pay some taxes to the Persian empire. We're going to use those to maybe build some roads and increase infrastructure and trade within the empire. And the idea is that that's going to be the trade-off. And so these cities start to fall under the influence of the Persians. And the Persians basically rule them as satellites. The Persians know that they're on the outer edges of their influence, so far away from the great Persian capital city of Persepolis at this point. And so the Persians know they're at the outer reaches of their influence. And so they don't demand direct control over the Greek city-states, but they demand that these Greek cities in Anatolia accept tyrants to rule over the Greek city-states who the Persians choose. And the Greeks see the power of the Persians. They see the benefits, the material benefits of being part of the Persian Empire. The Persians, remember at this time, have a reputation for being merciful rulers, benevolent rulers, unlike the Assyrians. And most of the Greek city-states accept this situation. But the Greeks are always uneasy about being ruled by the Persians. And this is where it's not just about material advantage. People think that characters in history only act from material advantage. If that was the case, it was probably quite advantageous for these Greek city-states to be part of the Persian Empire, to have access to the opportunities to do business in Persia in this way. But remember, that's not just what Greek culture is about. There's a lot of aspects of trade and interacting with foreign cultures. That's a big part of Greek civilization. But there's also this aspect of individuality and freedom. Individuality, freedom, and this means that the Greeks are always suspicious and always uneasy about these tyrants that are promoted by the Persians, and the idea that the Persians would rule them and the Persians live so far away. This is really antithetical to the Greeks, who come from this area where you don't have big plains. Instead, you have mountains and little valleys, and each valley and each hilltop is kind of its own separate political entity. And so the Greeks are never particularly content subjects. And so in 499, so now we're moved in just into the 5th century BC, these Ionian Greeks, these first wave colonization Greeks who live in Western Anatolia, they rebel against the Persians. They declare their independence and they appeal to the Greek city-states on the mainland to help them. And what happens? The Spartans refuse. Partly because they have a religious festival that's going on, secondly because it's so far away. Remember what I said about the Spartans. They do not like sending their army a long way away from Sparta. They're worried that if they do so, there'll be a Helot uprising those who are subject to the Spartans, who are being ruled by the Spartans. And the Spartans will be able to control this uprising, and they'll be defeated and overthrown. So the Spartans refused to help the Ionians. The Athenians sent them about 20 ships. So there's no sense at this point that the Greek city-states were particularly anxious to defend these Greek colonies on Western Anatolia that were being menaced by the Persians. All they really got was about 20 ships. So the Greeks perhaps don't see a great menace at this point, or at least not one that they're willing to sacrifice for. The rebellion was actually initially successful. Greek city-states band together. They attack Lydia, which is now a territory in the Persian Empire. Remember, it takes the Persian army a long time to mobilize. The Persian army is very successful if the Persians can pick the time and place and launch an attack and just overwhelm their enemy with their numbers. But this is just a rebellion that blows up in their faces, and it takes them a long time to put an army together. And so this Greek rebellion is quite successful. It's quite successful initially, but in the end, it's going to lack the support, especially in Anatolia. The Greeks just don't have the numbers to continue to win. And so it takes the Persians 4 years to put an army together to put this rebellion down. Imagine if that was the case today, like you had a state that rebelled against the federal government, and it took the federal government 4 years to make that state part of the Union again. Well, there was one of those. It was the Civil War with lots of states. But in this case, it's just one tiny state. It's just one tiny state. It's like Rhode Island rebelled against the federal government. And it took 4 years for the federal government to get its army together and to bring Rhode Island back into obedience to the federal government. And we understand that the Persians were really upset about this rebellion. The revolt is suppressed, and Miletus, which was the main Greek city-state, or the biggest Greek city-state, remember that was the home of all these philosophers. So it's an important place of meeting between emerging Greek philosophy and also between Babylonian, Middle Eastern science and philosophy. And this city is burned to the ground and destroyed. The inhabitants of the city are deported. They're deported as far away as India. Remember, the whole shtick of the Persians was, we don't do deportations. That's what the Assyrians do. And so there's a sense here that the Persians were really worried about this rebellion. That they were really worried about rebellions like this at the edges of their empire that's becoming really huge at this point, that they're not able to control. And so their attitude is, we have to make an example of these annoying little Greek cities that have staged kind of a serious rebellion. We have to make an example of Rhode Island, otherwise California will rebel, and then we have real problems. California and Texas will rebel, and we have real problems. And so it's thought that that's why the Persians come in so strongly and deal so savagely with this rebellion. They have to make sure that more rebellions don't break out across the empire. They have to show that they punish the rebels in this empire. But there's another after effect of this. So the Persians have established control, but the mainland Greek city-states, like Athens and Sparta, are now quite worried about Persia. Whereas before, we'll send you 20 ships, good luck, we're going to keep trading with the Persians. Now there's a growing concern in ancient Greece that this is going to come for us, that this empire isn't going to stop in Ionia, in Western Anatolia, that it's going to spread and it's going to come to our cities. And this is the way the Persians behave. This is the closest the Athenians and the Spartans have come to seeing what the Persians are like. And their experience is that the Persians seem to be pretty brutal conquerors. There's this language about how they're nicer to the people they conquer than the Assyrians. Doesn't look very different to the Greeks. And so this is the beginnings of actually Greek resistance to the Persians on the mainland, which hadn't been such a great focus before. I'm going to talk more about that in the next video.